I try to imagine a fellow smarter than myself, and then I try to think, what would he do?
Charge up your axons, ready your receptors, and shift your lobes into upper beta phase. You are listening to Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast dedicated to helping you optimize your brain with the latest breakthroughs in neuroscience, nootropics, and psychopharmacology.
Hello and welcome to Smart Drug Smarts. I'm your host, Jesse Lawler, excited to bring you episode number 62 in this podcast dedicated to the betterment of your own brain by any and all means at your disposal. This is going to be a special episode for the ladies, which is kind of because this is about a drug that is only taken by women, although one that pretty much everybody's heard of, everybody's aware of, and one that probably nobody, certainly including me, had any idea really had a direct cognitive effect on the brain, but apparently it might, and that is the birth control pill, hormonal contraception, which has been around for, I guess, the better part of 50 years now, and is taken by about 100 million women worldwide, and a small, recent, almost accidental discovery has shown that it tends to affect the gray matter of women that take it, and not always in the same way. So we're going to be talking with the lead researcher in that study, Dr. Belinda Pletzer. That will be in the main part of the show. And if you hang around until the end of the episode in the ruthless listener retention gimmick, it's almost going to be like the special after-school special edition of Smart Drug Smarts, where we're going to be talking about drugs and addiction and a really interesting article that I just read that kind of turns on its head a lot of assumptions that we probably all carry about what drugs and addiction actually have to do with one another. And kind of will make you feel like giving somebody a hug after hearing that part of the episode. Anyway, I don't want to get all teary-eyed just now. What I do want to do right now is This Week in Neuroscience.
Smart Drug Smarts. This Week in Neuroscience.
So a lot of us that are into smart drugs are also probably trying our hand at things like Lumosity.com and other online brain games that make claims about improving cognition in one aspect or another while we're playing these games. And of course, the holy grail of these sorts of ideas is to be able to have a general improvement in cognition, something where we're not just getting better at one specific skill set that we're doing a lot in the game, but something that would translate out to our behavior in the rest of the world, the rest of our lives, etc. But the Federal Trade Commission just stepped in and smacked down a company called Focus Education, which makes a product called Jungle Rangers, which was claiming in its advertisements that the game could help improve school performance in kids that played it. It even claimed it could help alleviate the symptoms of ADHD, and the FTC says, Focus Education, sorry to tell you, these claims are not backed by science, and you're going to have to stop advertising that way or else. Focus Education has backed down. And apparently the FTC is going to be stepping in sort of industry-wide on the brain games industry, which is a pretty big one. They say that Americans alone spent $1.3 billion on brain games in 2013. Lumosity.com is probably the 800-pound gorilla of the online brain training world and makes the somewhat less controversial claim that its games are, quote-unquote, based on neuroscience. A lot of cognitive psychologists and neuroscientists, however, aren't necessarily believers in brain games. Late last year, Stanford University's Center on Longevity and the Berlin Max Planck Institute for Human Development released a joint statement signed by more than 70 of the world's top cognitive psychologists and neuroscientists that included the following text. The strong consensus of this group is that the scientific literature does not support claims that the use of software-based brain games alters neural functioning in ways that improve general cognitive performance in everyday life or prevent cognitive slowing and brain disease. So, as is probably never a bad idea when it comes to advertising, temper your enthusiasm with a little bit of research and beware of spectacular claims in any and all things. We will, of course, link to this article on the website. In the audience feedback department, actually, I feel like on these podcasts, we unfairly promote, publicize, etc., the people that leave reviews on iTunes versus the folks who just email us directly. And of course, we completely appreciate both of them. We love hearing from people on email and get a ton of great feedback and ideas and stuff from all those emails too. I guess if we're unjustifiably biased towards the iTunes reviews, it's simply because having the good iTunes reviews helps us get promoted within sort of the iTunes podcast ecosystem and helps other people find out about us when they're looking around for podcasts to become interested in iTunes than they might not have heard of us otherwise. Anyway, without going too long into that, I wanted to say thank you to listener dwood60, who gave a 5-star review on iTunes and said that Smart Drug Smarts consistently brings on really top-notch researchers and academics, folks without a book to sell. In other words, they don't just book whatever authors have a new book to flog. A lot of the folks that they talk to seem genuinely surprised that someone has gone out of the way to find out about their work. The result is, frankly, a podcast that has more information and fewer cliches than most others in the genre. Thank you so very, very much. That is high praise indeed. And yeah, it's a dirty and sometimes difficult job digging these academics out from under rocks sometimes, but thanks to Rhiannon for really attacking that job tooth and claw and getting us some fantastic interviews. And if in your reading or stumbling around online or in academia or any of those places you come across somebody that you think would just be a shockingly great interview for Smart Drug Smarts, definitely feel free to throw a recommendation our direction. Oh, and I wanted to do a quick callback to a couple episodes ago, the blood work episode with Dr. Alexis Shields. Now, one thing that a lot of you might have caught, I don't know, at least one person mentioned it in a response on the website and did not take kindly to it. In fact, neither did I, was early in the interview, Dr. Shields was talking about what she was trained in as a naturopath, and rattled off among a list of things was the word homeopathy, which I let slide at the time, but I remembered later in the interview, oh shit, I wanted to go back and ask about that, and I hadn't. So I emailed Dr. Shields a couple of days later because, I'm just going to read to you an email exchange between Dr. Shields and I. I said to her, you mentioned homeopathy as being something that you studied as a naturopathic doctor. I thought that this was a totally discredited pseudoscience that has never been borne out any better than placebo. Am I off base? This is the less medicine you take, the more effective it is concept, sort of the opposite of a minimum effective dose, yes? And Dr. Shields responded, so homeopathy, yes, I hear ya. I thought the same thing when I first started naturopathic school. However, I started seeing some crazy results when it was used in a very specific way by a skilled practitioner. So I ended up studying it for the last 6 years, and I will tell you that we do not understand fully how it works, but that when used the way that it is used in Germany since the late 1700s, called constitutional homeopathy, you can see some incredible results. I've also experienced it with my own health issues, and it works most consistently with children and animals, so we know it's not a placebo thing. The studies done on homeopathy have very poor methods, and so they are not a good indicator of success rates. The people studying them often do not understand homeopathy or how it needs to be studied. However, more on this soon. I'm actually going to write a big post and make a video about it because it's a frequent question. I'll send it to you when I'm done. So when I get that blog post from Dr. Shields, I will link to it on the site so we can all sort of follow up on that. I'm kind of the mind that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence school of thought. I think that's Carl Sagan that said that. Yeah, I guess I'm just going to wait and see what Dr. Shields gets back to me with and consider that one sort of a door slightly ajar case until then.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So this interview that you're about to hear with Dr. Belinda Pletzer was actually spawned by an email that we got from a listener, Dante, in Raleigh, North Carolina, who recommended an article which referenced a paper which was based on the study by Dr. Pletzer, who we're now about to talk with. And this was almost a This Week in Neuroscience that I was just going to do as one of the little segments that we do. But I read it and I was like, wow, that's actually spot on Smart Drug Smart stuff. That's the direct and possibly beneficial effects of a pharmaceutical on the human brain. So let's see if we can actually make an episode out of this. It's a little bit shorter as far as interviews go than some of the interviews that we do, but I think nonetheless really interesting and really potentially profound as far as the amount of effects that this kind of thing might have on society. As Dr. Pletzer points out, more research is really needed, kind of inspired by these small studies, since there's every reason to believe that there probably are effects going on that we just don't really have full data on yet. With that as preamble, let's jump in.
So it started during my dissertation, my doctoral thesis. We were actually looking at hormonal influences on brain activation during number processing, and we just happened to have two samples of women available, so women who don't take the pill and women who do take the pill. And we thought, well, why not compare them? We started with brain structure and found that they actually differ a lot. So in that study, women on hormonal contraception had much larger gray matter volumes in the frontal cortex and also other areas in the brain than women who do not take hormonal contraception. And after I finished my dissertation, I also looked into differences in brain activation between pill users and non-users. And after that, we thought, there's many different types of pills available, and they have different composition in synthetic estrogens and progestins. And why not look into whether there are differences between different types of pills on how they affect the brain? So that's how it all developed and how it happened.
Really interesting, almost by accident.
Yeah, the first finding was by accident, and then I just got curious and I thought, well, I want to follow up on it.
As a guy, I think of the pill as one thing, capital T, capital P, the pill. There's no differentiation among it, but in reading this study, I came to learn that there's actually several different types of pills that I guess have some commonalities, but not 100% commonalities. Can you kind of break that down as to how hormonal contraceptives are chunked into these various groups?
Well, I think the most important differentiation, which is also the one I used in the article you called me about, is the differentiation in pills that contain progestins that are able to bind to testosterone receptors. That's androgenic progestins. And then there are pills, those are the newer ones actually. They contain progestins which are not able to bind to testosterone receptors, and those are called anti-androgenic progestins. So there are pills that cause androgenic effects, similar to effects caused by testosterone, and then there are pills that cause the opposite.
A testosterone-like effect would be extra hair growth and things like that?
Well, in extreme cases, yes. So, very extreme cases. I was digging into it, and I think they were trying to get rid of all those androgenic side effects, as they called it, from the original pills. Because, testosterone in women, as you said, hair growth, even though not every woman on the pill has extra hair growth, but also acne and weight gain or weight loss and all kinds of effects on the body that women don't find particularly
flattering.
Yeah, thank you. So they were trying to get rid of that. That's how they ended up with the anti-androgenic progestins.
And how long has that been the norm? How long has the anti-androgenic version of the pill been what most women are taking?
It differs by country. I spent some time in the US 2-3 years ago, and most of the women participating in my study there, they were on androgenic progestins. That's the older ones. And I did my dissertation study before I moved to the US. That was published in 2010, and a lot of the women participating then were already taking anti-androgenic progestins. And when I came back in 2012, almost all the younger girls participating in my studies, they are on anti-androgenic progestins. I think that doctors maybe find, they seem to have less side effects, especially on young girls when they start taking it at the age of 15, 16, 17. But they also have a higher risk of thrombosis, and I think that's probably why US doctors don't prescribe them that often. But I'm just speculating. I'm not a doctor myself. So.
One article said that worldwide there's 100 million women that are taking one version or another of the pill. So this is a huge swath of people that this thing would affect one way or the other.
Yeah, it's true. It's a huge ongoing experiment.
So go back to what you were saying about larger volumes of gray matter in certain areas of the brain. And this was specifically for the anti-androgenic version of the pill?
In the first study, we didn't even ask the women what kind of pill they were taking. We just, are you on the pill or not? And they said yes, and we just put them in the scanner, and that's what we compared. And so for the first study, we had larger gray matter volumes in the frontal cortex, and we can't say what type of pill caused it. We don't know that because we didn't ask the women. And that's why we did the follow-up study where we differentiated between the androgenic and the anti-androgenic ones, and we found that they have quite opposite effects on gray matter volumes.
So here's a question. When a group has a larger volume of gray matter, I sort of assume that there's a fixed amount of space within the skull. So what's being squeezed out to make room for that extra gray matter? Is that less white matter? Is there some sort of extra fluid in there that's getting squeezed out?
That's a tricky question because researchers, we don't even know what larger volumes of gray matter mean in the brain. So there's a lot of different possibilities because MRI is like an indirect measure. We can't cut open participants' skulls and weigh the brain or measure it. It's just indirect. It's an imaging method. So it could be, but that's the least likely possibility, that there are extra cell bodies formed. And so there's more brain cells in this region. But more likely possibility is that the cells that are there, they just grow more spines and they're connecting more tightly with other cells. There are more synapses between the cells, and that would also show up as larger gray matter volume on the images.
So you saw this growth in gray matter was not evenly distributed across the brain, but had a couple of key areas. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, for the first finding, it was the frontal cortex that was larger in pill users than non-users. But when we differentiated between androgenic and anti-androgenic, we found that with anti-androgenic progestins, we had larger gray matter volumes in the fusiform gyrus. That was also a region that was larger in the study where we didn't differentiate between the progestins. And for the androgenic progestins, we had smaller gray matter volumes in the frontal cortex in pill users than non-users. So that's opposite to what we found before when we had the mixed group. So there's still a lot of research to do to figure out what it does. But the fusiform gyrus seems to be a very consistent finding. There's 3 studies by now that found that fusiform gyrus is larger in pill users or a particular group of pill users than in non-users. And the fusiform gyrus is responsible, for example, for face recognition.
What else is the fusiform gyrus used for besides facial recognition?
Different parts of the fusiform gyrus are used for recognizing different parts of the environment. So there's a special area for faces, but there's also an area for building and one for objects and one for places. And I think it's also part of the reading network. So where you recognizing letters or whole words, that's what it specializes in.
So, and then the testing that you did on these women sort of as follow-up to see how they actually would perform on tests of facial recognition and things like that. Talk to us about that a little bit.
Yeah, so the anti-androgenic pill users, those that had the larger gray matter in the fusiform gyrus, they were better at face recognition. We showed them faces before they went into the scanner, and about half an hour later, we showed them double the amount of faces, and they had to indicate whether they had seen the face before or not. And they made a lot less errors when they were on anti-androgenic progestins than those that were not using any pills.
How significant was that difference?
The women who were not using pills, they made about 26% errors. They gave the wrong response to those. And in women who were on anti-androgenic pills, we only have 20% errors, a little less than 20% errors. So probably a 6-7% decrease in error rate.
That seems like a fairly dramatic result, though. I mean, to have a 5-6% difference, we think of the pill as being a fairly innocuous drug, and most people certainly don't think of it as having any overt effects, maybe mood effects, but not necessarily cognitive effects.
Yeah, that's true. Cognitive effects of the pill, they have simply not been studied. So there's like probably a handful of studies in those 50 years that the pill has been on the market that did study cognitive effects as a side product of studying something else, and they never followed up on the findings.
Anything else you'd like to add? Any final parting thoughts?
The one thing that always has been important to me is that cognitive effects of the pill or effects on brain structure or function are just something that should be studied. You know, I have those 2 or 3 studies out now, but they are all there on small samples, and they need replication, and we just need more data to fully understand the effects of the pill on the brain. And I just don't want anybody going home with thinking, the pill may make me smarter, or it's bad to take the pill because it makes my brain probably grow smaller or something, because we just don't have enough data to support something like that, to say something like that. But we have indication that it has an effect, and we need to understand what that effect is.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So thank you very much to Dr. Pletzer for taking the time for that interview. I just found that one to be such a shocker, thinking that this drug that's so famous that we call it the pill, I mean, probably one of the most famous drugs in the world, still has some surprises in store for us. I kind of would have thought that an effect as potentially dramatic as that would not be something that we're just finding out about now, 30, 40, 50 years after the fact. And the second study that you referenced, if I remember correctly, there were about 60 people total, approximately 20 in each of the groups of non-pill takers, pill takers that were taking the androgenic progestins and the anti-androgenic progestins, and which isn't a huge study, but on the other hand, the size of the discrepancies in the results was still enough for statistical significance, even in group sizes that small. So yeah, definitely very much merits further study. Moving right along, as promised, the ruthless listener retention gimmick.
Smart Drug Smarts. Ruthless listener retention gimmick.
So I read a really interesting article on the Huffington Post by author Johan Hari, hope I'm pronouncing that right, who's the author of a book that's either about to come out or has just come out called Chasing the Scream, the First and Last Days of the War on Drugs. And I don't know what the book's about. I haven't read the book. I just read this article, but the article was really interesting, and it was talking about what I guess is something that the author sort of came to realize in the course of doing the research for his book, which is this really, really deep-seated assumption that I think all of us make about what addiction really is, that addiction, especially when we're talking about drugs, is mostly a physiological need for a particular chemical. Once you start taking heroin, your body wants more heroin, you feel withdrawals. If you don't get the heroin, you yada, yada, yada. And so fighting something like the drug war is going to be most effective if it's based around the actual access or lack of access to these particular chemicals that are believed to be at the root of addictive behaviors. And he references sort of the classic commercial from like the 1980s where it shows these rats given given access to an unlimited supply of, I guess, cocaine in their water, and that 9 out of 10 rats given this access to cocaine will have nothing but the cocaine water until they short circuit their little rat brains and OD themselves. But that there was one glaring problem with this study, which was that there was really nothing for the rat to do in its little isolated cage except to eat cocaine. And that in a situation like that, yes, pretty much all rats are going to have cocaine until they die because they're in a pretty unstimulating little rat environment. But when subsequent researchers kind of gave the rats a rat pleasure paradise environment where there was lots to do, things to sniff around and play on and platforms to climb on and wheels to run in and other rats to screw and all that stuff, that the rats really didn't ignore. They sort of tested the cocaine water, but they weren't that into it. None of them became coke addicts. None of them died. And it really kind of turned the results of the first experiment entirely on its head. They still had all the access to the cocaine. They just didn't choose to take it versus the other things that were available in their environment then. The article makes some really interesting analogies with humans, which, as you might imagine, is the more important part for the listeners of this audience, and how there's plenty of opiate-type drugs that if you break your leg or something, you might be taking an opiate for pain control for a period of time. And if it was really just a matter of the drug and weaning yourself off the drug being so hugely difficult on a purely physiological basis, most people, when they're being weaned off those drugs, they would start looking for heroin, going to their street dealers and finding some way of getting an opiate back in their systems, even if their doctor said no. I mean, that's sort of what the traditional mythology that we have built around the way addiction works would lead us to believe. But in fact, of course, this almost never happens. We wouldn't even think of that being a normal behavior of somebody recovering from an accident where they were on painkillers for a while. But instead, the people that do tend to be real, what we think of as drug addicts in our society, the people that really have a major problem related to substances, are in a way akin to these poor rats in this sort of sensory deprivation style environment where they don't have desirable things to do available to them, and that given their fairly bleak environment, the drug is the best option that they've got available. But if given the opportunity to get into a better environment and do things that are more rewarding, that the mental, emotional, cognitive desires to stay involved with the substance would really fall away and not have nearly the hold that we really think of them doing on a purely physiological basis. Really powerful article, even for those of us that think, oh yeah, the drug war's stupid, we've been fighting it wrong, it shouldn't be fought at all, blah, blah, blah. I think this kind of reframing it as being built on an entirely false presumption of what the relationship between addicts and substances is sort of a new idea and really worth giving a lot of thought to.
Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast so smart, we have smart in our title twice.
Okay, that is the entire episode number 62. If you liked this episode, please send it along to your friends. Send it along to anybody that's taking the pill that you think needs to know about this hot off the relative presses information. And I would like to give myself a little pat on the back that the last 2 episodes, you might notice, have come out less than a week following the previous episode. So trying to crank things up here a little bit around Smart Drug Smarts, not stick to our historical and disconcerting tradition of sporadic and relatively infrequent publication. It is January the 27th as I record this. I don't think we'll get another episode out before the end of the month, but what I think will be episode number 63 is going to be a really interesting one. It is one that I had to get military clearance just to do the interview, so brace yourself. The show notes for this episode will be online at smartdrugsmarts.com, including the links to everything that I talked about here, and I will be back at you quite soon with my undiminished enthusiasm for helping you fine-tune the performance of your own brain. Have a great week and stay smart.
You've been listening to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Visit us online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com and subscribe to our mailing list to keep your neurons buzzing with the latest in brain optimization. Smart Drug Smarts should be listened to for entertainment purposes only. Although some guests on the show are medical doctors, most are not, and the host is just some random guy. Nothing you hear on this podcast or read at smartdrugsmarts.com should be considered medical advice. Consult your doctor and use some damn common sense before doing anything you think might have a lasting impact on your brain.